Hi, our group presentation is about endosymbiotic theory. So our question was, how did the endosymbiotic relationship between mitochondria and eukaryotic cells begin? So for our background, endosymbiotic theory is a theory that eukaryotic cells evolved when large prokaryotic cells engulfed smaller free-living bacteria that later became organelles through symbiotic relationships. These include mitochondria and chloroplasts, and there are some evidences such as them having their own DNA, and they also have multiple memories surrounding these organelles, which kind of insists that they once were free-living organisms. So the first paper that we read is called Endosymbiosis and Eukaryotic Cell Evolution. This one introduces serial symbiosis theory, and kind of it says the background of the endosymbiosis. There are basically two competing theories, such as serial symbiosis theory, which is kind of the one that we're familiar with, that eukaryotic cells arose from multiple symbiosis. And there was a competing one that's called autogenous model. This theory was saying that organelles evolved through internal compartmentalization, and basically the mitochondria and the chloroplasts also came from one lineage, and just a prokaryotic cell just like later like developed it internally, instead of engulfing other organisms to develop those organelles. But later on, RNA sequencing proved that the serial symbiosis is correct and autogenesis is not really supported, because these classes had separate bacterial lineages supporting that they were once different organisms. So how does endosymbiosis work? This paper explains that first, like a gene of the organelles, which were once like free living organisms, gets transferred to the host meaning the prokaryotic cell that it was engulfed to, and the protein from the host is imported into organelle, kind of creating this like exchange between them, and they later become symbiotic. And there are kind of two possible models of how this occurred. There's mitochondrial late model, and there's mitochondrial early model. Like the name suggests, the late model is saying that there was a prokaryotic cell that developed nucleus and cytoskeleton and all those like features of like early eukaryotic cell first, and then later engulfed the bacteria. But this theory is these days not as supported according to the paper, because there are primitive, like the earlier on like ancestors of these eukaryotic cells that already shows like evidence that they had mitochondrion. So probably this is not very supported these days. Um, on the contrary, the early model is suggesting that archaea engulfs this bacteria first, and then since this bacteria was producing hydrogen, which helps the host metabolism, it increased the metabolism, and later they kind of formed this permanent symbiosis, which this model is more likely of how the endosymbiosis actually works. So kind of other points that this paper discusses is that not organelles were all developed through endosymbiosis. For example, like nucleus was not, and endomembrane was not. It was developed internally. And probably endosymbiotic event for both rise and both mitochondrion and plastids only happened once, because this is kind of rare event, so it would have been unlikely that it happened multiple times. Though the scientists believe that unlike mitochondria, plastid probably went through secondary and tertiary like endosymbiosis event, meaning that like other eukaryotic cell ate this, kind of engulfed this eukaryotic cell with plastids, kind of leading to further spread of it. And because mitochondria was providing energy, eukaryotes could have this kind of like complex like system within it, because it requires energy to do that, and the mitochondria was able to provide it through embryosynthesis.
So for our project, we asked ChatGPT 5 progressively more detailed questions about how the endosymbiotic relationship that led to mitochondria began, and we compared its responses to the first paper. So for the first question, we asked the general question, how did the endosymbiotic relationship between mitochondria and the eukaryotic cell begin? And ChatGPT gave a clear textbook explanation that an archaeal host cell engulfed a bacterium related to alpha proteobacteria, and this became a mutually beneficial relationship that evolved into mitochondria. This aligns with the paper, which also supports endosymbiosis as the origin of mitochondria. For the second question, we asked, why is it so difficult to determine exactly how endosymbiosis happened, even with modern genomic data? And ChatGPT explained factors like deep evolutionary time, gene transfer, and genome mixing. This matched the paper, especially the idea that eukaryotic genomes are highly complex and mosaic, and makes the origin difficult to reconstruct. For the third question, we asked what do scientists think the original host cell was like before mitochondria evolved? And ChatGPT said it was likely an archaeal cell related to Asgard archaea and described it as simple and metabolically limited. However, this is where we start to see a difference with the paper. The paper emphasizes that the identity of the host cell is still an open and unresolved question, while ChatGPT presents a more specific and confident answer. For the fourth question, we asked what evidence supports the hydrogen hypothesis and what are its main criticisms. And ChatGPT accurately described the metabolic partnership and listed supporting evidence and its criticisms. This also matched the paper, but ChatGPT presents the evidence in a more structured and convincing way, whereas the paper emphasizes that the evidence is indirect and difficult to interpret. For the fifth question, we asked, can you compare the mitochondria early and the mitochondria late models and explain which has stronger evidence? ChatGPT concluded that the mitochondria early model has stronger evidence, and while this is consistent with modern thinking and scientific literature, the paper presents the debate as more open-ended and unresolved. I think overall, ChatGPT did a strong job of explaining the big picture and became more nuanced as we asked more detailed questions. However, it did tend to simplify uncertainty and present complex scientific debates than compared to the paper. But at the same time, I didn't ask like more follow-up questions or like try to like argue against it because like I did notice that the paper was written in 2015, which is over 10 years ago, and ChatGPT reflects more recent scientific developments, which is where I would hypothesize that the difference comes from. Because a lot can change in the literature landscape in over 10 years. And so while ChatGPT won't necessarily give the same answers as the paper, I still think it is at least like a somewhat accurate tool to start off of to be able to understand these concepts.
That we will analyze is Endosymbiotic Theories for Eukaryotic Origin, published by the Royal Society in September of 2015 by first author William F. Martin. The paper examines how complex eukaryotic cells evolved from simpler cells known as prokaryotes. The central idea is endosymbiosis, which is, as mentioned previously, where one cell lives inside another and becomes a part of it. The most important event was the origin of the mitochondria that came from a bacteria living inside of the host cell. The paper also says that the host cell was most likely to be an archaea. This created a hybrid cell with both archaeal and bacterial components. They compare many different theories, but the main one emphasizes that the particular symbiotic relationship between the archaeal host and the mitochondrial bacteria was a foundation of eukaryotic life. The main takeaway is that the mitochondria was essential for the evolution of complex cells that we see today. They provide an incredible increase in available energy for each cell, which allowed them to develop features such as a nucleus and internal compartmentalization. The paper highlights the hydrogen hypothesis. The archaeal host requires hydrogen for its metabolic processes, while the bacteria is hydrogen producing. The two cells dependent relationship, which I would assume to be characterized as mutualism, is what drove the symbiotic relationship. Importantly, all eukaryotes either have mitochondria or evolved from ancestors who did. With time, some cells were able to acquire plastids, which led to plants and algae. Overall, the paper argues that the energy constraints are what shaped evolution, and that this single symbiotic event can explain how complex life evolved once. Complex life did not evolve gradually, but emerged from a partnership that changed what the cells were capable of.
All right, so for paper two, we asked ChatGPT the same question, and it basically gave the same response. And this goes directly against the hypothesis of paper two because paper two suggests that instead of a eukaryote engulfing a prokaryote, it's actually two prokaryotes, specifically archaeons, in a symbiotic relationship. What they termed was a syntrophy, where they basically just feed off of each other's waste products. And the paper suggests this because the complexity needed to perform phagocytosis, like the cytoskeleton and the energy cost, was far too great to be possible before aerobic respiration. Oops. And then so I followed up with this question. Could a host cell have evolved the ability to perform phagocytosis before it acquired mitochondria? And it basically just doubled down on its answer, saying that primitive phagocytosis, or at least membrane engulfment, likely evolved before mitochondria, which kind of just uses like a circular reasoning without really much any supporting evidence. And the paper would respond with the same argument, saying that phagocytosis without oxidative phosphorylation is way too energetically costly. Furthermore, there's no evidence of any primitive prokaryotes with the ability to phagocytize. All right. And lastly, I asked if mitochondria evolved primarily to allow cells to use oxygen, how do you explain the existence of eukaryotic anaerobes that have mitochondria-like organelles but don't use oxygen? And ChatGPT basically says that these organisms are descendants of aerobic eukaryotes and adapted to anaerobic environments. And the paper would have responded by saying that no, like the ancestor of these endosymbiotes are more likely to be facultative anaerobes that gain the ability to do aerobic respiration. In conclusion, both of these papers emphasize the need for energy in order to kickstart the cellular complexity, such as the nuclei and other membrane-enveloped organelles. And so these two papers go against ChatGPT's complex eukaryote theory first and then aerobic respiration. But then again, both of these papers were written over 10 years ago, and ChatGPT supposedly has the most up-to-date scientific knowledge.